so much for joining us tonight. My name's Claire. I'm a fourth-year medical student here and point person for the Baroque Foundation. This is the penultimate lecture in our Ideals in Medicine series, and we're very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Dorval Wales. He's a chaired professor in theology and philosophy at Hillsdale College, and he has degrees from so many excellent institutions. I'm going to struggle to name all of them. Engineering from Swarthmore, cognitive and natural language from University of Edinburgh, Oxford theology, PhD in theology from Notre Dame. He's really a very gifted scholar and thinker, and he's going to talk to us today about artificial intelligence, the promise and the peril. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Wales.
I'm very pleased to be here this evening. It's the very end of spring break. My children have been home for a week. And so leaving them alone this evening is a mark not only of my enthusiasm for this venture, but also my wife's strong support of it. But the weather's been good. And so I'm here tonight to talk about artificial intelligence and the practice of medicine, a field for which I have great respect. My father is a physician. He moved through several specialties, began in pediatrics and family medicine, and then ended up in anesthesia, because just as cases became very interesting, he always had to hand them off to a specialist, and he was tired of doing that. He wanted to see something through all the way and really get into the details of it, and he did so through anesthesia. And I suppose that's how I came to where I am as well, that I wanted to see the whole picture. So that led me through engineering and psychology, and finally into theology, which for me was the field in which I wouldn't have to stop asking questions. So I'm going to attempt, from the position of a theologian, my specialty being in early and medieval Christian theology, from that position to attempt to say something about what it means to use artificially intelligent tools, how they interact with us, and how that might bear on the care of human beings in the field of medicine. I consider myself a student of, rather than an expert in, the use of AI in the medical field. And so I look forward to a spirited discussion afterwards with all of you. What does it mean to apply theology to the question of artificial intelligence in medicine? The problems that we can consider with respect to AI and with respect to medicine are old problems because they are human problems. And it's from that standpoint that I'll venture today to say something theological about them. I want to begin with a way in to the question of the promise and the peril of artificial intelligence through the concept of bias, which enables us to consider some of the problems that confront us in our use of AI in specifically human contexts, especially in two examples, one that is easier than the other, and that would be policing, and then the more challenging case, the medical field. So bias is a rightly unpopular phenomenon in our day, but in one sense all of us are biased. When we deliberate about an action, when we wish to select a course other than what is suggested by impulse or instinct or habit, we have to capture and interpret reality. We have to schematize it, to make sense of it, and direct our action within and toward it. Even before we deliberate, interpretive reductions are part of our biological makeup. And many of you are more qualified than I to comment on some of these. For instance, in our selective sensitivities to the environment, how our nervous system makes stimuli feel, and in our uniquely rational tendency to wonder about and to conceptualize the things that we experience. So whether inborn, habitual, or carefully considered, our reductions of our experience can yield insight. We are revolted by the smell of rot. We tell children that some berries are edible and others are only for birds. We discuss race as both real and socially constructed, and we talk about degrees of realism in our accounts of how we know the world. Now, this is particularly helpful to consider in the case of medicine, where skilled clinicians must develop a sense for what matters in the course of bringing a patient to full health. They learn to notice certain things about the patient. For instance, when when I first introduced my girlfriend, the one I married, that is, to my father, he immediately noticed that she had a kind of funny way of walking. And he said, you know, that's going to cause her trouble later on, and she should consider gait training. I brought this up later, and he was a little shy. He's like, oh, I don't remember that. And maybe he did. He's 75, so they're actually he's older than 70. I think he's 78. Hope he doesn't watch this. I know his birth year somewhere in there. But in any case, he had learned to notice these things because these are the things that mattered in his particular field for assisting patients in coming to full health. On the other hand, our perceptual and conceptual specifications are varying sensitivities or reductions or focuses on particular aspects of what we see and what we learn are seen as undesirable biases when they are not so much selective of the scope of human life and action as they are distortive within it. I cannot, but bees can, see ultraviolet reflecting markings on flowers. And fire pains me. These are examples of selectivity. A three-month-old's greater comfort with faces, colored like that of her primary caregiver, or a child's expectation that a secretary will be female, or all the jokes suitable for this audience, the jokes about, all these jokes that trade on the expectation that a doctor is male. I can't call them one of mine, but you know what I'm talking about. These statistically accurate, perhaps experientially derived expectations are boundaries that ought to be expanded by rearing, lest they become biases that govern one's life and limit one's experience. Because what is beneficial to family bonding or statistically accurate in waiting rooms is a distortion when it becomes a conscious or unconscious norm that governs one's societal experience and behavior. So the tension between how our images of reality make it navigable and how they may distort it is markedly apparent in the phenomenon of AI bias. Contemporary machine learning techniques, especially the deep neural networks that dominate today's landscape in a variety of fields, including medicine, have yielded AI systems that, despite astounding successes, are also notorious for their failures. Especially in areas of race and gender, their biases range from the jarring, for instance, Barack Obama's pixelated face reconstructed, that is, confabulated in high resolution as Caucasian, and the troubling, for instance, Amazon's face recognition software marketed to law enforcement agencies was far less effective at determining the gender of women of color than of light-skinned men, to the life-changing. Again, Amazon's experimental hiring algorithm discriminated against women. And this was a really interesting case because they would remove all the markers of gender, including the names, from the application letters and the CVs. But culturally speaking, and perhaps there's a biological basis to this as well, women tend to use different words, a distinct clustering of words in their application letters than men do. And because Amazon had usually hired men, for whatever reason, the system learned, based on previous hiring patterns, to exclude people who made excessive reference to collaboration in their letters, and these tended to be women. But it took them a while to figure out what the system was doing, because they just noticed that women weren't being suggested for interviews, and so they had to go deep into it to figure out what is it sensitive to in these applications that's causing it to exclude women. And these biases can even be frightening. Prison sentences are influenced by racially correlated inaccuracies in the COMPASS algorithm's prediction of recidivism. And a hospital's software for predicting care needs consistently deprioritized equally sick black patients. All of these biases that we find not amusing but disturbing concern our use of AI systems to make decisions about fellow human beings. We call it bias rather than selectivity or sensitivity when, by relying on AI for decision making, our pursuit of one good seems to harm another, or we don't even seem to get the good that we were looking for by deploying the system in the first place. Biases arise from a variety of factors in the preparation of AI systems. They can arise from the data set on which the AIs were trained, and this is why Barack Obama's pixelated face was reconstructed as Caucasian. There were more white people in the training set. They can also arise from the architecture of the systems, the human interpretation of the results, or combinations of such factors. Each etiology calls for a unique solution, but the general predicament of these systems falling short of what we expect and what we have designed them to do, can be illuminated as it applies to our own ethical lives by being set within an early Christian discourse on idolatry. For this, I look especially to North African theologian and Bishop Augustine of Hippo, who lived from 354 to 430. And if you're looking for a little bit of entertainment, there's a great Twitter feed called Augustine of Hip Hop, in which there are Augustinian-inspired versified commentary on daily life. There's also Kim Kierkegaardashian, and there is Kantier West, who has a lot to say about the transcendent existential, well, popping champagne with T-Pain at 30,000 feet. But in any case, an Augustinian reflection on AI bias, especially in the medical field, suggests three claims. First, by considering the difference between human and artificial intelligence, we can see how technology can become an idol in a very particular Augustinian sense by being wielded to exercise seeming control over what we cannot understand. Second, contemporary AI's great success, the deep neural network, is open to what Augustine would consider idolatrous misuse at several levels, both in being an image that can replace reality, and because the neural network itself somewhat echoes the character of the idolatrous mind. And third, Augustine's solution to idolatry, which would be for Augustine, that God's self-revealing incarnation as one of us, suggests that optimistic visions of an AI-driven future in which we will all finally be able to relinquish responsibility for our difficult decisions are essentially inadequate to the needs of human life. In the end, for the physician, to do no harm, we must allow, Augustine would argue, human love a scope beyond what technology can represent. So, first, on technology and idolatry, the first point. To consider the relationship between technology and the idol, an ancient concept that we don't usually encounter in modern life, let us first distinguish between the intelligence of humans and the intelligence of AI. Intelligence, from the Latin intelligentsia, corresponds to Augustine's concept of understanding. Understanding is an act by which we know through attuning ourselves to reality. This is the origin of our notion of intelligence. For Augustine, and as modern psychology affirms and neuroscience shows, every act of understanding is shaped by one's desires and the movements of one's will. This doesn't just mean that we decide what we want a thing to mean to us, but for Augustine, we begin by apprehending something through the senses, and then implicitly or explicitly, we judge it as good, as real in some sense, by clinging to it in some way with our approbation or love. When you think of the experience of a child, I was really enthralled by my children who, as every child will at a certain age, would squat and watch a beetle for an hour crawling across the ground. And there's a sense of, in that sense of learning, in that sense of trying to comprehend it, the sense of wonder that draws us on to learn more deeply of something, it is not just a desire to have the information or to have the solution to the problem. It's a desire to know, and a desire to know is carried forward by a certain, Augustine would say, a certain love, a certain sensitivity to the goodness of the thing, a certain attraction to it. And when we are attracted to something, we don't just want to be near it more, we want to know it better. And so as we come to judge it, whether implicitly or explicitly, even our sensitivity and appreciation for something is in this sense a judgment it is by this that we come to a deeper understanding. So as we cling to it by our approval or love or desire, we conceive a conceptual understanding, which Augustine calls a mental word, a verbum mentis. This understanding is shaped by our attraction to some aspect of the thing that we know. Knowledge is contoured to the knower, and specifically knowledge is contoured to the knower's desire or attraction for the object. Or, as the scholastics learned from Aquinas, quid recipitur ad modum recipientes recipitur. Whatever is received according to the measure or the manner of the receiver. Many such acts of desirous understanding or appreciative knowledge, according to Augustine, weave the habitual fabric upon which reality is known. So in a certain sense, knowledge proceeds by making a decision about how we stand toward the thing that we know. Understanding is as much a self-positioning toward the thing that is understood as it is an insight into what is understood. And so understanding comes very close to decision-making for action. An action that we take is not just a movement in space. It's not just a manipulation of something that we know. It is an outward expression of a certain intuitive understanding that itself is a positioning of ourselves toward the good that this thing is. The modern concept of intelligence somewhat reduces this notion. Intelligence, as it is contemporarily defined, somewhat wants the fruit of this action without the personal engagement of authentic understanding. When we are considering the field of artificial intelligence, intelligence is usually defined as a capacity for efficaciously achieving goals. And the greater the intelligence, the greater the scope of goal achievement, and the greater the efficiency with which these goals are achieved. In the goal that is set for an artificial intelligence system, we still have a human-generated stance of love, of decision, of valuation, in light of which the system is defined. But we don't acknowledge this aspect of love or desire or valuation. Instead, the AI sees, as it were, more than we can in its ability to achieve goals. But the way these goals are formulated is in terms of a scale of objective and quantifiable value by which we evaluate the performance of the AI system. Its powers of correlation, of prediction, and of action recommendation or decision exist within a framing of goals and utilities that our labeling and quantified training measures implicitly encode. And so an example would be the system I mentioned earlier that deprioritized the black patients for treatment at a hospital. The goal was to treat the sickliest patients first, not necessarily the sickest, but those who were likely to have the worst outcomes. And so they had to train the system to take in a tremendous amount of demographic data and symptoms and attempted diagnoses in order to determine who should be treated first in a hospital with limited resources. And one of the factors that was included in the training data was how much money someone had spent on healthcare in the past 5 years. Now, this is very much likely to correspond to one having a weak constitution or being a sickly individual, requiring more medical intervention. It's also likely to correspond to who has the money to spend on healthcare. And so the system consistently deprioritized minorities who happened to be minority groups that were likely to be impoverished because they had spent less money on healthcare. And so it was only after a while of this, when adverse outcomes began to become apparent, that they realized that the decisions and the values implicitly encoded by the training data in the system, in other words, the assumption that finances correspond with sickliness, were in the end false. So when we just throw a bunch of data into an AI system and try to train it to optimize some factor, in this case, what it boiled down to is the ranking of people according to how much money they'd spent on healthcare. that encodes already certain decisions that we don't even realize we've made by the way that we design the system. So the difficulty with the definition of intelligence as a capacity for task achievement is that it both ignores the first-person felt apprehension of goals, our sensitivity to the values that we're pursuing, as well as the wider context of human decision-making within which the AI system exists. It ignores that loves shape our measures, and that measures cannot encompass the totality of what may be happening. It seems objective, in other words, but it is not, because the AI system exists within the subjectively delimited goals and values of the human designers and users of the system. So, how does this relate to the concept of idolatry? When this intelligence, efficiency in achieving human-specified goals, displaces intelligentsia, the felt sensitivity to the landscape of goods through desire and love, our use of tools can become what Augustine would call idolatrous. Let me explain. Tools function to extend and to facilitate the human will working upon the world. Oftentimes, we must work on the world to affect what we do not explicitly understand. And we have ways of doing this well. Most of our tools do not arise from well-worked-out theories, but from long experience, the development of a certain sensibility. Hammers, screwdrivers, knitting needles, and other tools were designed not by theory, but by experience. There is something musical about our use of tools. We become attuned to the relationship between our physical action, the physical thing we are working on, and the results that we get. This perhaps no more the case than in musical instruments. Our action is fully immersed in the larger context. We control something or we modify it not from without, but from within. We deal with it from amidst the results that we seek. There are things about sailing that one cannot explain, or at least that if one explains them and defines them, they are not felt by the student until the student has the experience, is within the context, can feel the tension in the sheets and lines, and can understand what it means to work with the wind and the sea and the boat. There are things, too, about medicine that only experience can give. And I remember my father telling me about, the simplest example is the kind of the human dimension of things, that for a while he worked in a hospital that frequently served drug addicts. And in the preoperative interview, as the anesthesiologist, he had to kind of figure out what was actually going on, especially if somebody came in with emergency trauma and needed immediate attention. They didn't have time for blood tests or anything. And so he had to learn how to talk to people who didn't want to be arrested for drug use in order to save their lives, in order not to give them a medicine that would kill them because they had just smoked crack half an hour ago. So there's that human dimension that only experience can give, and similarly, there's a kind of sensibility within the operating room where one develops a not entirely expressible instinct or intuition about what will work. And I suppose that's why my father, as a jazz pianist, in the end was particularly attracted to anesthesia, because there is a kind of alchemy to observing the body and working with it and knowing just how to titrate the medications to yield the best result. What is happening in all of these cases is a kind of attunement to reality. That's what's happening over there. And this attunement to reality sometimes operates in reverse. We aren't attuned to reality because we know it, but we come to know it because the system we're interacting with responds to us. Its reality pushes back against us, and we must modify our own interior expectations in order to act within the system or toward the system in such a way that we are acting with it as it is. There's a certain sense in which we must become friends of the greater reality that we are trying to work with. We begin to form a sense, and it is only after forming this sense or sensibility about what we interact with that we can become observers, forming concepts, and then even theories. This is how we work with tools. This is how we work with larger realities such as the ocean. And this is why tools, when they're used at their best, become a form of intimacy with the world rather than simply a form of control over it. But it is different when the tool becomes an instrument of control that is detached from any implicit intelligentsia, detached from any implicit attunement to the greater reality that we are dealing with. Then the tool sets us at a remove from the system. It becomes a buffer between the system and our will and our goals, rather than a way into it. Evil, Augustine tells us, is located in the choice to reduce all things to the role of fulfilling my own desires. And so when we step outside the system, as it were, and attempt to manipulate it blindly, we subject it to the role of fulfilling only those desires that are encoded or encodable in the tools that we use. And this is where, we talk about something being too blunt an instrument. It's not able to interact with the system at the level or with the fineness that we need. But this becomes very dangerous when the bluntness of the instrument is something that we cannot appreciate because we don't even understand that to which we apply the instrument. Here, when our intelligentsia is no longer active, the intelligent tool, blindly pursuing the goals that we have appointed for it, becomes an idol, by which the ancients and the medievals meant an instrument of control that hides its own limits and gives us the illusion of godlike comprehensiveness. When we subordinate the world to the scope of our desires, we engage in what Augustine calls pride, Latin superbia, not a healthy regard for one's own accomplishments, but a preference for domination rather than self-gift. Augustine explains that superbia originates when he says the soul abandons God as its highest aspiration and seeks to become its own satisfaction, a kind of end to itself. Now, for Augustine, our personhood is constituted by God the Creator, and it is in relationship with Him that we find our final fulfillment. So to be our own satisfaction, we must escape our need for relationships with others and, ultimately, with God. To do this, superbia must suborn all things to itself, by judging them according to their satisfaction of one's own desires. Therefore, Augustine writes, more is often given for a horse than for a servant, more for a jewel than for a maid, because the necessity of the needy or the desire of the pleasure seeker does not consider a thing's value in itself, but rather how it meets one's need or pleasantly titillates the bodily sense. Superbia extends this self-centered evaluation of the world into an illusory domination of it by idolatry. For Augustine, idolatry does not fundamentally mean offering incense before graven images, although one might do this if one thinks it will work. Rather, the idolater replaces the true God with some lower reality, particularly a reality that can be comprehended within the idolater's own horizon of valuation and power. And since this reality is controlled by the idolater is thus covertly set at the pinnacle of all hierarchies, accomplishing total domination by ignoring what cannot be controlled through the idol. The Babylonians sacrificed to their statues to gain harvest-bringing storms and peace-bringing victories. Ebenezer Scrooge set money as his horizon and was self-blinded to all that money could not buy. Both cases are idolatrous because both attempt to deny one's own insufficiency or the limitations of one's own perspective by positioning oneself as master of the levers of what really defines the universe. And this is why, in the story of A Christmas Carol, it's so important that Scrooge never buys anything. Everything has a price in his world, and the price encompasses the value of the thing. And so Scrooge works for his whole life to attain all the money possible, so he could buy anything, and then he buys nothing. So it's really from a psychological perspective, the notion of pride is not that one walks around claiming to be God, or that one has some sort of conscious desire to unseat the Almighty and command the worship of the whole world. But superbia, as Augustine understands it, is really kind of the tragic bid to hide one's own insufficiency by revaluing the world in terms only of what one can control. And so, idolatry in that sense is less a kind of malevolent thing in the sense of like the Emperor in Return of the Jedi or something, and is more a kind of tragic hiding from one's own need, or hiding from the limitations of one's own perspective or ability by exercising a putative control over everything that matters by means of the thing that thereby becomes the idol. So it is human to navigate reality in light of images, schemas, and devices that are oriented toward action within reality. But these tools only become idols when superbia clings to them in place of reality, denying what cannot be compassed within their horizon of apprehension and control. Sorry, I lost my place. Their horizon of apprehension and control. The problem is not in attempting to work with what we do not understand. The problem is the pathology in which we force what we do not understand into the scope of what we can control. All right, on to the second point. Deep neural networks and AI systems, both as images and as idols. An artificial neural network receives a pattern of information as numerical values at its inputs, which are connected with various strengths to layer upon layer of further nodes. And at each node in the network, when the sum of the incoming connections exceeds some preset threshold, the node will fire, and its own signal will be transmitted variously to layer upon layer, and so on. If you put in a pattern at the beginning of the network, it is transformed, as its elements are recombined and processed until something comes out on the final layer of the network. A network can be trained to produce desired behavior by adjusting the strengths of its connections, thus adjusting the contribution made by each node to each recombination and in due course to the final result. A piano offers a poor analogy, but a useful image. If you've ever shouted into a piano with its sustaining pedal held down, and I recommend that you do this when your parents are gone and your sister is out to play, so you can really have a go at it, then you have heard its tuned strings resonate with the different frequencies of your shout. One receives back from the piano a sort of echo, not of one's words, but of the tones of one's voice. Similarly, as the neural network is tuned, and I later learned in engineering that actually because the strings of the piano are tuned to different frequencies, what you're getting is a frequency decomposition of your voice. It's like a Fourier transform, if you've ever studied that. You get all the different frequencies, and then when they're piled back on top of each other by all the strings resonating, that's how you get back an echo of the tonality of your voice. It's similar to how MP3s work as well for compression. Yes, so similarly, as the neural network is tuned, as its connection strengths are adjusted, it begins to resonate with the entangled relations that are implicit in our world, including relations that cannot easily be discerned or logically represented by human investigators. But by its training, the network doesn't just echo, it transforms its numerical inputs to make explicit those relations that are of interest to the trainer. The deep neural network is so called because it has not 2 or 3, but dozens or even more layers, which with perhaps millions and even billions of connections. Such a network, when trained, becomes a kind of image. As AI researcher Kate Crawford explains, the network predictively generalizes. It performs an induction by learning from specific examples which data points to look for in new examples. And the looking for certain data points is not so much a matter of looking for cues that you could actually point to. The network is developing a sensitivity, a sensibility, almost something more like a sense of smell, or the training of a palate with respect to the dynamics that are present in the numerical data. One might hope that, given a rich enough set of examples of inputs and outputs, the trained network could accommodate the messiness of the real world without any reductive bias. As noted above, this has not always proven to be the case. Instead, deep neural networks often manifest systematic or consistently reproduced errors of classification or recommendation when presented with new examples. Whatever the particulars of this or that case, Augustine's theological analysis discloses the deeper principles of this bias in three potentially idolatrous moments: the human collection of training data, the human interpretation of network activity, and the network's echoing of the human mind. So first, idolatrous training. Idolatry is seeded in the collection of training data. Classifications are themselves technologies. They are tools that both produce and limit our ways of knowing, writes Crawford, and they are built into the logics of AI. So, in presuming to reduce the world accurately to the terms that we can define within a data set, system designers have already exercised a power to decide, as Crawford says, which differences make a difference. Often and without acknowledgement, these decisions will flatten complex social, cultural, political, historical relations into quantifiable entities. If you've ever thought about how to measure success in any task, if you've ever downloaded some sort of app that is trying to help you become more productive, or trying to, you're trying to cultivate some habit. I'll just speak from my own experience. I downloaded this habit app, and because I wanted to become more productive at work, and so the first thing I noticed that I should add to the habit app was not reading the news while I was at work. According to my phone, I was spending an ungodly amount of time reading the news. So in my habit app, I very successfully eliminated the reading of news, and I was scoring 100% on my, it was fantastic. But when I stepped back to look at things, I was now reading novels. I was taking these little breaks, between my Pomodoro sessions, but the novel breaks were getting larger and larger, and so the real problem, the deep problem of procrastination, wasn't really being fully solved by the things that I could quantify and measure. There was something deeper going on that perhaps had to be addressed in a different way. But because I, as the classifier, had labeled the data of my day for this system in a certain way, the recommendations that it made, and my pursuit of the goal of maximizing my score on my habit app hadn't actually yielded the outcomes that I wanted. So an example of the way in which we can become tools of our tools. We begin, like a teacher teaching for the test instead of for the knowledge, we begin living for the test instead of for the actual goal in service of which the test was first designed. On the other hand, to avoid such difficult choices, designers made trained systems on numerous measurements gathered by countless devices across multitudinous interactions in the hope that by discovering the deep harmonics of this big data, the network will have laid hold of the reality that is of importance. But here too, we have chosen to believe that what can be measured in a situation is all that needs to be measured, allowing the affordances of our tools to become the horizon of our truth that determines our interaction in the real world. These approaches are necessary for the development of tools, but also fraught with idolatrous potential, because the supposedly context-free human has to assume responsibility for being the master of the domain in question. We sketch the map, and so we've assumed that we are actually able to sketch the map of what matters in order for the AI system to learn how to do it with a finer degree of sensitivity. But if we deny our role in labeling the map, if we seek independence from needing to have a point of view, then we practice the potentially prideful illusion of mastery, with data, instead of Ebenezer Scrooge's money, as the proxy for our own ultimacy. By denying our dependence upon and foundation in a larger reality, we deny our limitations. We make ourselves arbiters of the relevant data space. A second problem, idolatrous interpretation. The tendency toward idolatry also beckons in that the aboutness of machine learning depends on our intentionality. Intentionality not as our volition, but intentionality as in the aboutness, the directiveness of our thoughts. A series of voltage levels on microscopic transistors does not supply its own conceptual interpretation. We supply it by framing the device's activities in our own conceptual space, just as we do for the smudges that we call letters in the cellulose aggregates that we call books. The machine learning system maps data inputs to predictive or action-selecting outputs in light of our purposes. But are those purposes honored by the input data and the way that we have trained the outputs? Is our conceptual framing of the network supported by its activity? The question being, have we developed a system that is actually doing what we think it is doing? Neural networks are opaque in that their interior sensitivities are not wholly interpretable. And in fact, these sensitivities become more difficult to ascertain with the greater complexity and sometimes the greater success of the network. Computer scientist Peter Norvig argues that, at best, the statistical attunement of a neural network, quote, describes what does happen, but because it makes no claim to correspond to the generative process used by nature, it doesn't answer the question of why it happens, end quote. Therefore, the neural network cannot signal whether its apparent success actually engages the phenomenon of interest, or whether instead it latches on to some correlated but non-determinative variable. Well, actually, I was about to give you an example, but I have another one right here in the paper. For example, a network that takes in prisoners' data points and outputs their chance of committing a crime again may appear to reach significant accuracy across a population of convicts, or the network may simply have learned to prioritize convicts from high-crime zip codes. Like the system that flagged as bone fractures all x-rays that happened to come from the hospital with the highest proportion of trauma cases. So they trained it to put in these x-rays, and it was supposed to put out whether there was a fracture, and it had great accuracy, better accuracy than a rapid review by medical specialists. But it turned out that the network, when they looked back to what is it sensitive to in these photographs, it was sensitive to the little code at the bottom of the image that indicated which hospital these x-rays had been taken from. Both of these methods, despite putatively high accuracy across a population, are both unjust and unmeaningful when applied to individuals. So yes, it is likely that a bone fracture will come from that particular hospital because people keep breaking their limbs in that zip code. But on the other hand, it has very little to do with whether or not this particular x-ray has a bone fracture. It's a little bit like one of my children in younger years, just in case he should watch this, who was having a dispute with some other children in the neighborhood and came home fuming. And I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "Well, they teased me." And I said, "Oh, well, tell me the story. What was going on?" Let's call them the Williams. I don't think they're Williams. And he said, "Well, it's just because they're Williams. Statistically a high correlation, but no explanatory value and no guarantee of that working out in the future under the assumption that people do change." On both sides, as my children mature as well, these disputes tend to happen less often. Alternatively, the network may not be accurate at all, but to recognize its bias may take time. So this is the system that deprioritized black hospital patients was noticeable only when long trends had emerged. Only the long-term failure of care outcomes and the racial correlation with care allocation could reveal the problem. In the physical world, a mangled steak quickly proves the dullness of the carving knife, but a black box that seems to perform can be followed blindly because we have labeled the outputs according to our intended horizon of control. in service of which we expect the system to generate a good mapping, whether or not that mapping can actually be achieved. Unable to see immediately whether the emperor has clothes or not, we allow the network to idolatrously replace reality because it gives us the appearance of control over dynamics that we do not understand. And this is a frequent subject of both movies and fiction in the 1980s and 90s, or perhaps even earlier, of the kind of bureaucratic procedures where someone's flummoxed when what they need to do isn't covered by the binder of solutions, or when they blindly follow a procedure in order to achieve an outcome, even when it's obvious that the procedure is not working. So this is a trope in comedy as well as in dystopian sci-fi movies, but at the same time, it's a trope because it's a deeply human tendency. That which seems intractable is also overwhelming, and reassurance is found in having some procedure that we hope will achieve some control over the problem. And then we have positive motivations as well, of course, in the field of medicine. We want to help someone who's sick. And so we try to find these solutions that can see beyond what we can see, even when sometimes the data that's being put into them is not actually sufficient to arrive at a solution, or the solution sought is being construed in the wrong terms. All right. Part 3, how do we restore our engagement with reality? Is all of this really a problem? After all, it is nothing new to say that to a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. In other words, if we use neural networks for what they are useful for, if we accurately interpret the scope of their output's meaning, then we don't have to go wrong. But this is not entirely true. The concept of idolatry points to systemic cognitive effects of how we treat AI or other tools. Too often, artificial intelligence and technological systems in general are credited with an esoteric power to penetrate reality in a way that transcends the limits of human understanding. An example of this, very simple example of this, would be the woman in Belgium who, or maybe she was in Germany, one of the two countries, and she wanted to go to a town that was 10 minutes away, and she put the address into the GPS, and there was a town of the same name in the adjoining country, and she drove for 2.5 hours, passing through the border before she acknowledged that, and I don't know if she got all the way there, but it took her 2.5 hours to realize that she was 2.5 hours out of her way, because this thing was telling her, turn right, turn left, 2.3 miles. And so this is a human instinct that when we don't understand how the system works, or when the system makes manageable that which feels unmanageable to us, we credit with a deeper insight than that of which we're capable. Anybody seen the show The Office? There's the funny scene when Michael Scott drives his car into a lake because the GPS is telling him to go straight. So while AI certainly exceeds our powers of correlation and inference, contemporary machine learning cannot transcend the human horizon because it maps human-selected data points to human-interpreted outputs of inference and action. If we credit it with more, if we neglect the crucial role of our own intelligentsia, our sensitivity to goals and goods, then, as the psalm warns concerning the idols, they have eyes but they do not see. Those who make them become like them, and so do all who trust in them. That is, having made our idols to manipulate some sphere, we will be bound by what they can represent. Concretely, we may think of two cases: predictive policing and medical treatment. The predpol system and other such systems direct police units to anticipated geographical hotspots of crime. These are selected by networks trained on past reported crime events, weather conditions, ATM and convenience store locations, and other environmental factors that have been observed to correlate with high crime. Patrolling these locations appears to reduce the incidence of crimes, often less by arrest than by deterrent. So far, so good. However, the apparent objectivity of predpol's ongoing training cannot procure some transhuman predictive insight. crimes are reported by citizens, but also by police. An elevated predicted crime rate will call forth greater police presence, possibly increasing the assessed crime rate as officers seek and find otherwise invisible infractions. This is why parents are told to catch their kids being good. You catch the kid being bad, you start focusing on that kid. Not only do you miss all the misbehavior of the other kids, but you also miss the good behavior of that kid. So this possibly increases the assessed crime rate as we seek and find otherwise invisible infractions. These locations then appear to be more distinctively crime-ridden than in fact they are, further biasing the system in its ongoing training. Once the trained system begins to direct actions within the environment, then the system itself is having an effect on the environment, and now the effects of the system are having an effect back on the system itself, which can either lead to a harmonization between the system and the environment, or in the case of predictive policing, can actually lead to a mutually reinforcing dysfunction. Additionally, over-policing, intensive crime-seeking, more aggressive police responses in assumedly high-crime areas, and more stops of innocent persons, all things that thoroughly apply to parenting as well, may break down community relations, exacerbating negative outcomes in the long term. When we feign independence from the world that we seek to control, when we ignore the fact that the system feeds on our own AI-driven interventions, then we conform the world to the idol. In that the AI is a means of control and not just a response to the world, we risk deforming the world by our use of the tool. By policing according to prediction, we risk procuring, or at least we believe that we see, the results that were predicted. The case of medical treatment is even more difficult, because to some extent medicine has always been a matter of treating what is not initially, or perhaps never, even understood. For this reason, the diseases that we wish to treat, or that all of you wish to treat, I wish to have treated, for instance, hepatitis A through E, are named for their symptoms, inflammation of the liver, and not their causes, a number of distinct viruses and transmission routes. In fact, as I discovered when I was checking this, I remember the time when I asked my dad, what's hepatitis? And he said, it's inflammation of the liver. And I said, what do you mean? Like that's just a thing going on. I want to know what's making it happen. He said, well, there are all these different viruses. What are they called? Well, hepatitis A. So you get it. You guys are doctors. And throughout the ages, medical treatments or pseudo-treatments have at times targeted these most likely of proxy variables, the symptoms, without actually addressing underlying conditions. For instance, 140 years ago, a wan paleness, perhaps due to anemia arising from a deficiency of iron, was treated in Victorian times by carefully titrated doses of arsenic, which restored a healthy glow to the cheeks and was thought to clarify the complexion. Of course, we now know that arsenic dilates the capillaries and in the long term brings about death. Only that long term helped to demonstrate the ultimately death-dealing properties of the attempted treatment. So too in many other cases. What may we do about the idolatrous use of biased AI, which all too often is bound to these observed correlations of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes without, as Peter Norvig said, necessarily bearing any relation to the underlying generative condition? While I haven't time this evening to unfold a full solution, nor am I perhaps competent to do so, being not a medical professional, I can say this much. While some propose addressing AI bias with case-by-case tweaks, a theological perspective contemplates more radical solutions, asserting that the ultimate context of intelligentsia, which frames all goodness and meaning, the context wherein this problem could actually be resolved, the problem of relying on tools that cannot deliver what we hope they will, must necessarily transcend both human and artificial understanding. In other words, Augustine would have us speak of God. The Christian tradition holds that idolatrous superbia is resolved by revelation and by love. For God is the always excessive frame within which alone reality can be rightly intelligized or understood as it is, and not just according to our particular wills. And since no knowledge is possible apart from our particular loves, a true knowledge will ultimately always love the known thing in God. For predictive policing, this means that when officers swarm a predicted hotspot, it is not that they must bring rosaries or statues of Jesus with them, but rather at least that they must not arrive as crime-seeking servants of the idol, but yes, as loving humans seeking to serve other humans. A simple solution, but one that has been difficult long before machine learning ever came to the scene. In medicine, a true knowledge is likewise born in love, whether the doctor believes in God or not. For the practice of medicine must always be located within the higher goal of bringing a patient to health, rather than simply of maximizing particular measures, however reassuring these may be. Concretely, it means using AI to drive deeper insights into the mechanisms from which certain conditions arise. In the case of deep neural networks, large language models, and other inscrutable recommender systems, we must not allow the medical profession to become dependent upon them. They must augment rather than replace the attuned sensitivity of the doctor. This is possible only when the AI system can point out why it has done something, recommended a course of action, or chosen a solution. Large language models such as ChatGPT, which are trained on uncountable, clashing, and value-laden human expressions of intelligentsia, remain opaque. So the variety of, I learned in preparation for this talk, recommender systems developed for the practice of medicine that are modules that sit atop these large language models. The large language models appear to have they produce behavior that is a sort of behavior that corresponds to some sort of insight into reality because they've been trained on millions or even billions of texts to predict the next word. And it turns out that humans have said a lot of insightful things that are available on the internet. They've also said a lot of crazy things that are available on the internet. And so what the large language models are is neither a coherent simulation of human psychology nor a reliable insight into the reality that humans write about, because all it's doing is saying the sort of thing that human beings have written on the internet in this sort of context. And that means that even if it's trained on the entire, Journal of the American Medical Association, I remember seeing JAMA on the floor and coming through our mail slot a few times a year when I was little. But even if it's trained on the entirety of that journal, nonetheless, what it is finding is a textually represented statistical route through the things that have been said in that journal before, which means it will have quite a lot of useful things to say, but it can't see beyond what has already been said. It can only infer between the sorts of things that have already been said. Those inferences are sometimes valid, and sometimes they're not. For an example of the perils of these large language models, you can think of a landscape. If you're given a topographical map at which the level of the land has been tested at a variety of points, you can infer from it a kind of rolling hill. You can even build a three-dimensional model of the ground. If, however, the survey happened to miss a deep ravine that was between two hills, and it marked it as a flat plain because it was taking its samples too widely apart, the inference that this is flat will not hold valid in reality. So too with the text that represents ideas. The inferences between those ideas, or if you request the system to correlate or to comment on the conjunction of certain factors that are rare, they don't just have to be unknown, they only have to be rare in the training set. Because if they're rare in the training set, they're not the sort of thing that seems to matter statistically. But human beings, we have a different sort of intelligence, a different sort of intelligentsia. That which is rare jumps out at us as worthy of further investigation. It is our desire and wonder that pulls us on. Whereas for the large language model, that which is extremely rare, or what are sometimes called edge cases, these things tend to have much less of an impact. And so other systems have to be designed to train the system more heavily on the rare examples, but then again, these are human decisions that are being made concerning what matters, and pretty soon, the most reliable way in which to determine what matters is simply to study the literature, apprehend it, practice it in real life, and then go train the system to do what you would have done. So it's a very difficult problem. It's a very difficult problem to have the AIs augment rather than replace the attuned sensitivity of the doctor. Other AI systems, however, do not fall into quite this quandary. A deep learning system was recently trained to correlate knee x-rays with patient-reported pain. And in this case, there was a very interesting racially correlated disparity that people of color tended to report greater pain after certain surgeries and with certain x-rays that appeared not to differ at all from the x-rays of white patients, but the pain reported was greater. So naturally, the solution is to prescribe more pain medications to them. The AI system was trained to take in the image of the knee x-ray and to output the expected pain scale, and it was trained to do so without any reference to race. And it was able to make the distinctions. It found the racially correlated distinction. And once it attained a certain level of predictive performance on how much pain will the patient report, they were then able to reverse engineer the system to find out which aspects of the x-rays had prompted those anticipated reports of greater pain, and then to discover that there actually were subtle mechanical differences in these patients' knees that accounted for the exacerbated pain, and that led, that at least the authors of the paper then proposed that different surgical practices could yield different outcomes rather than just throwing more opioids at it. So that's an example of a way in which an AI system, because of the way it's trained, is able to yield insight rather than just shielding us from the reality and recommending what we could have done already, more pain medications. This system worked for two reasons. First, the correlation between input and output was a correlation between observable conditions and patient reports, rather than just a correlation between observable conditions and the sort of things that people have said in these contexts. That is, the correlation involves the patient's intelligentsia, their subjective apprehension of their reality. And so here, to restore them to health, even though we can quantifiably measure it by their degree of freedom from pain, is still a quantification that is anchored within their experience and thus not subject to reduction. The second point, the system does not attempt solely to treat the symptoms, the pain report, but then uses those symptoms as symptoms of causes to discover the underlying mechanism by which the system's successful report was procured. In other words, what is going on with the knee? Again, it is because this system is trained in a treatment context, the context in which the intelligentsia of the doctor and of the patient remains active in the use of the system, so that the intelligence, goal achievement as measured, i.e. reduction of pain scale, is linked to intelligentsia, the physician trying to understand the relationship between the patient's experience and the patient's body, with applications to further patients' real needs and not just further patients' pain reports, which is different from maximizing more distant outcomes that are not patient-centered, such as prioritization based on financial outlay. So, the temptation to serve the idle, whether in policing or in medicine, is exacerbated in part by expense, by understaffing, and by the hope of an efficacy that might exceed human abilities. But as I hope that I have persuaded you, intelligence as the efficient achievement of quantifiable goals is never enough. When the technologies that are meant to make it easier to deal with this world become opaque buffers between us and the world, reducing the world to a thing not to be understood, but only to be controlled, a thing not for intelligentsia, but only for intelligence, then we implicitly accept a position, ultimately, of conflict with that world. For overtaxed security services or medical practices, this is understandable, but it brings a cost. The ancient Babylonians, unwondering masters of data fitting, sought exacting astrological forecasts, but showed no interest in astronomical mechanisms. Their cultural orientation matched their cosmogony, their account of the cosmos, in which the world was fashioned from the bisected carcass of a primordial chaos dragon. It is not a world that invites inquiry, because it is not a world that requites wonder. Redolent of menace, it is not to be understood, but only to be controlled. Our stance of will toward the world, whether toward our fellow citizens or our patients, shapes our own intelligentsia by an implicit ontology that shapes our practice and our particular drawing forth of the world's capacity for meaning. When AI systems become unexamined instruments of reduction that maximize measures, yet without inviting understanding, then we risk becoming practical Babylonians, with the instrumental framing of our tools dominating our framing of the people to whom we apply them. What then must we do? As theologian John Cavadini puts it, for Augustine, the sign systems that we create are no better than the love in which they were ultimately begotten. We must develop and deploy AI tools that lead us back to the wonder of the persons that we treat, by striving to understand and by refusing the easy claim that an AI system bears no relation to the generative processes of nature itself. To do no harm in this context means to refuse reduction. We must reckon in some sense with the fullness of a world that has God himself as its source. So long as we keep ourselves as users of our tools, rather than blindly following them, a tool that cannot accommodate the fullness of the world can still perhaps lead us to it by routes unexpected. For this to happen, love for the patients as the persons that they are must govern the careful development and deployment of AI systems as tools of insight. For a love that seeks to hold in itself the whole good of the patient will not easily permit intelligentsia to collapse into mere intelligence. Thank you. So I'm happy to entertain questions for the conversation. Any questions? Yes.
I don't have a concrete question yet because I think I'm going to need a while to marinate on all of this. But I'm thinking a lot about just AI in general. I feel like really can do damage on our sense of self, our self-efficacy, how much we trust not only patients and the decisions that are made by other people, but ourselves. And so I was thinking, I really liked your point about this idea with superbia that we hide from our own sense of self-insufficiency. But we also, as you later pointed out, we live in a society or a system that rewards sufficiency, not insufficiency. So there's that pressure that's there. So it's not that this is just inherent within us, but it's almost taught to us to want to hide from our own lackings. If that's the case, whether, like, I see these sorts of things as being tackled by education systems, for example. Like if your kids are in school, you want them to go to school where they teach them to trust themselves and to make decisions and to be able to listen to nature and listen to their sense of self. But beyond that, how do we make a difference here?
Yeah, I think that well, I don't know if this really responds to your question fully, but just thinking about the clinical context, I remember when I was growing up and there was something going on with, I always wanted to figure out what was happening. My knee was hurt or something, and I would ask my dad because he was a doctor, and he would always say, just tell me how it feels. And I'd say, well, I think what's going on, no, just tell me how it feels. Because he wanted to get the kind of the unprocessed information so that he could set it within the context of his wider experience without my obfuscating explanations. And that can be, every every few months or something, I see some essay in the Atlantic or something about the alienating experience of being a patient and of having the doctor, of the patient feeling as if the doctor is treating the patient simply as a talking data source. Like, I don't want to know what's going, I just want you to tell me which boxes on this list to check so that I can figure out what your so I can classify what your problem is. And on the one hand, we could say, well, that's the doctor behaving like an AI classifier system. Just saying, let me get the list of symptoms, and then I'm going to crank it through my little recipe, and I'm going to yield the prescription. And I don't really want to know anything about what you think is going on or what your great Aunt Hilda said about it. Like, be quiet and just help me check these boxes. That's what's going on there, though, is that in the ideal, like I said, the doctor is trying to locate the patient's symptoms within the doctor's greater experience and ability to apprehend the whole. A certain wholeness is being pursued, even though it takes the form of the pursuit of just this list. And so I suppose in the clinical context, this tension between sufficiency and insufficiency and the way that patients experience themselves to be reduced by the diagnostic process could perhaps be ameliorated by, you spoke of culture earlier, by a culture in which not just mechanisms but experiences are valued. Because what the doctor really does want to know is the patient's experience. And in a culture in which the patient and the doctor alike may be implicitly trained to seek mechanisms and classifications as the objective stuff of what really matters here, which is understandable because we're dealing with a physical organism that, how you feel about it doesn't necessarily dictate what's going on. And yet, for many of these things, it is the feeling and the experience that alone gives the doctor access into the condition. And so, I know this isn't exactly what you asked. I'm kind of answering a different question.
Yeah.
So, in terms of like the training of doctors, perhaps if the doctor at his or her best is going to provide a clinical environment for the patient in which the patient feels the doctor wanting to know him or her, or at least that aspect of the experience which really brought the patient into the office in the first place. And that can be alienating when it's just like shut up and point to this like numerical scale, or it could be deeply healing in a psychological sense by the doctor saying, "Tell me what it's like." And those are actually interactions that are serving the same purpose. I do remember that my grandmother was telling me about some interaction she had with the doctor, and he was asking, like, was it a burning pain or shooting pain? Is it a prickly pain or anything? And the doctors have to get through this stuff really quickly because there are a lot of people lined up. So she goes ding, 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 ding. But actually, what's being asked there is kind of beautiful. Like, tell me what it's like from the inside. And I'm going to bring forth all of these analogies to try to give voice to your experience, because only if we give voice to your experience can I engage in the attempts to heal you. And so I think that if that can be part of the training both of doctors and of patients, but then the doctors are going to have to teach the patients to value what the doctor's doing, and that's going to happen by the kind of bedside manner that the doctor brings with it. I guess in summary, I'm being a little loquacious here, but in summary, the doctor's pursuit of an objective description of what only a subject can give to the doctor is actually the pursuit of as accurate as possible an apprehension of the subject's inner experience. And that's something very beautiful. That's an act of love. That's an act of friendship. Yes, yeah.
My follow-up very quickly. That being said, I also think a lot about how we're limited by language. And so if a doctor asks me what's wrong, I can feel it, but I don't necessarily know how to put it into words. So then that would also limit the doctor's data set in a way. And so for me personally, I'm trying to just expand my vocabulary and expand my language to learn more about how to express the way that I feel or the way that I experience the world, but not everybody that I interact with is going to be like if you say a
They're not all
prickly feeling
going
or a
for
burning
words.
feeling or whatever it is, like I could think the word is prickly, but it was actually burning, sort of thing. Where is the truth that's there?
Yeah, I mean, this happens with, little children when they come to report that they were mishandled physically by another child, like, well, he punched me in the stomach, and I'm imagining, like, a really violent interaction where it's like, I just walked past and my hand brushed it. And somewhere between that is what actually happened, because the children start out with fewer words, and also they tend to describe the experience in a way that gives full weight to what they see as the moral character of what happened. And so, but yeah, I think this is a cultural difficulty. We live in a culture in which less time is spent attending to our environment and giving words to our experience. We live in a culture in which poetry is less valued. And in which there isn't as much of a poetical tradition as once there was, and so there's less of a common inheritance. But we still do all run into like doors and doorknobs. Like, does it feel like you ran into a round doorknob, or more like you hit the edge of the door? And things like, I think that there's still a embeddedness in our physical environment that we all bump into, and so in that sense, a patient who maybe have less of an education may still have had enough encounters with the sharp edges of the physical environment that then the doctor, and again, this calls for a kind of imaginative exercise on the part of the doctor to locate oneself in the kind of environment that patient occupies. I mean, even a guy living under a bridge is maybe going to have a better language for pain based on the feeling of laying down on gravel or tree roots than someone who has a nice house outside of the city, who's going to be more likely to think in terms of sharp edges on doors or stainless steel doorknobs and things like that. So the physical environment perhaps gives us a point of connection with the experience, even of those who are unaccustomed to describing their experience. Yes, Claire.
That was a beautiful talk.
Thank you.
So I think my instinct is really to agree with you, and so I'm going to try to poke a few holes in what you said.
Great.
The point of machine learning is because, one, we have an overwhelming amount of data, but also doctors are facing in clinics an overwhelming amount of need. There's so many diseases, so many problems that can be addressed. There's not enough people to address it. And as you just said, trying to take the internal experience of the patient and turn it into objective data is so much of what we do on rounds. I mean, the first thing you're taught to present is the objective data, what's on the basic metabolic panel, what are the liver function tests. These are all numbers that we are in effect chasing. And when the number goes outside of a certain range, red flags go up, and very skilled clinicians will know, oh, that's borderline, or oh, in this case with this kidney disease, you don't worry about that number so much. But we are always chasing numbers, and that's actually what we're promising patients, is that we'll chase those numbers for them, and that's what we're doing. At what point do you know that a number or a tool you're chasing has become not a useful tool but an idol? Especially when the whole purpose of this is so that you can deal with large quantities of patients efficiently. So you can't sort through one by one the way you would like to if we lived in an ideal universe. And then two, is it the case that in a secular world where we're not talking about God and it's considered inappropriate perhaps to do so in the hospital, must every tool become an idol necessarily? I mean, is that just part of the problem? And then in that sort of world where science has replaced God as sort of the limit on our horizon, how do you even begin to have this conversation? And can you have a conversation without using God to try to open people's eyes to how tools have become idols?
Yeah, okay, so for the microphone, I guess a couple of questions. One being, in a society, a secular society that doesn't have God as a point of reference, how can we express the risks of tools becoming idols? And then also in a practice in which dealing with numbers is necessary for dealing with large numbers of people, every tool therefore become an idol? I think those are great questions, and I'll deal with the tool as idol first, and then how do we talk about idolatry. I was at the courtrooms are public, and I once got to sit in a courtroom and observe a prosecutor at work in a small town with the various people that came in, and they had all committed very objective violations for which there were penalties on the books. One guy was caught speeding out of his own driveway, and there were a couple of drunk driving cases, and his license was suspended in Indiana, but he was still driving in Michigan, and it was unclear whether he even had a Michigan license or not, and whether the suspension mattered. And the prosecutor was moving through these cases very quickly. I thought at first the prosecutor was a defense lawyer, because he was sitting down at the table with them, and he was like, what was going on, this, okay, what if we do this instead? And I realized that he was the prosecutor, but he was cutting deals with all of these, what do they call it, defendants, before they even met with the judge. And then he'd just slide the paper over to the judge, and the judge would say, do you want this deal? They'd say yes, and they were gone. But the way he was talking to them, it was very quick. It was like watching a doctor in a very busy doctor's office. And he was getting enough of the story that he could sort of see the picture in his own mind and figure out what had happened. The guy who was caught speeding out of his own driveway had been called because it turned out that his daughter, her period had started, and she was embarrassed in class. She was wearing white pants, and indeed, they confirmed that he was found holding a pair of black teenage girls' pants, speeding one-handed down the street. So, and the prosecutor's like, well, your daughter probably doesn't want that in the record, so you don't know what state this was in. Your daughter probably doesn't want that on the record, so let's do this and this. How can you reassure me that you're going to drive more safely if you're responding to a family medical emergency like that? That's what we'll put in the report. But what was going on there was that, yes, the prosecutor was using objective measures, and then he was asking for the context behind those objective measures, and was developing what he saw as a treatment plan so that these people wouldn't end up in court again, so that they would live as safe and law-abiding citizens. And so what does a doctor do when a doctor has to do all of that with numbers? The prosecutor at least has stories, but the doctor just has numbers. Most of the patients might not even know why they have these numbers. The doctor has to know it. I think that in order that the prosecutor was able to keep the law from becoming an idol, just an instrument of control that hides the complexities of life. He was able to do that by getting the stories behind the infractions. The doctor has a greater challenge in dealing with the numbers, because the numbers make things accessible. The numbers can also become an end in themselves. But the various numbers and rubrics and schemas have been developed because they tend to work. And that's not a bad thing. And so, but there's a way in which the doctor can develop an intuition which is just the mapping between the symptoms and the usual prescribed solution. And between those, that's just the doctor taking in the input and then directing an output. The AI could do that for the doctor. But what becomes important then for the doctor to have an internalized sensibility in which the doctor's actually seeing the patient as much as possible as he or she is to pay very close attention, and perhaps this could be maybe it is part of the training of doctors for medicine, pay very close attention to the cases that don't work as normal, the abnormal cases, the cases when someone just doesn't quite seem to respond the way they're supposed to, because that could be dismissed as like, well, this person's kind of messed up, although I doubt that any doctor would do that. But those are the very interesting things, because those are the circumstances in which, as children, that's what excites our wonder, the things that don't behave the way they're supposed to. And that's why children, as G.K. Chesterton says, older children want to know what's behind the door, younger children are amazed that a door opens at all, and they just want to see it open and close. So they're crucial to efficacy in the practice of medicine, I would say, and crucial to not allowing rubrics or tools or procedures to become idols that hide the reality, is that sense of wonder. When something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to, that's when one has to ask more or do a little bit of research. Does this slow the pace of treatment? Yes, it does. And the last thing perhaps many busy doctors want to do when they get home is research that one case that didn't quite work out. More efficiency would demand hand it off to a specialist, like just dismiss it as, this is something I shouldn't have to deal, I can't deal with, I'm busy, the other person's going to deal with that. But I would suggest that it's precisely those moments that can cultivate the deep intuitions and sensitivities that move a doctor from being efficient to being great. Another example from my own piano playing childhood is piano tuning. That my parents would hire the piano tuner who didn't use an electronic tuning device to assess the particular notes, because he would listen to the way each piano has its own resonances, and these change and distort the sounds of the notes. And if you just tune to the frequency for each string, it'll sound fine. But if you want it to sound great, you have to pay attention to the way the vibrations are interacting with the case of the piano, the notes with one another, the overtones, the undertones, and he had a finely developed ear. Why? Because instead of just following the numbers on the display, he listened to the piano. And so there has to be, in the ideal, doctors will have the encouragement to engage in that listening by looking at those cases that don't play the way they're supposed to. And they will also, the medical system will support doctors having the psychological and chronological space in which to do so by creating supportive cultures in which doctors are not just trying to work through as many cases as possible, but are able to seek help from one another. It's just like marriage and parenting, right? If you're just trying to get all the kids to bed and just being like, you're in the wrong place, go, there's some of that, right? But the one kid, in the movie or in the storybook or in real life, but we only notice it in the movie because we're not trying to be efficient. But the kid's like, but Dad, yeah, go put your pajamas on. But Dad, yeah, have you brushed your teeth yet? But Dad, and the kid has something really important to say but never gets to say it. He goes to bed sad and then tells his older brother like something horrible that happened to him at school that the parent never got to hear because he was just, go do this. It's only in paying attention to the symptomatic but dads or but doctor, sometimes only coming from the body, that the doctor can develop that refined sensibility so that the tools don't become idols but become ways in. Sometimes when the tools don't work, that's when we see more deeply. So, again, a very long answer to a very good question. Your second question was about, which I hope I can treat more briefly, was about when we don't have God to refer to, what can we do? And I think that the Christian tradition offers us something that the Western, even the secular tradition, has deeply embraced, and pop culture now even more deeply embraces, which is the notion of love as willing the good of the other, but also love as desiring union with the other. A union that in the Christian tradition is especially exercised through knowing the mind of the other, through being acquainted with the experience of the other. And certainly in like pop psychology and self-help these days, knowing people getting in touch with trauma and understanding one another's negative experiences and the ways they process those and the ways that affects people's experience and actions and psychology is very much in the public eye now. And that is the kind of long-term downstream legacy of the Western tradition's shift from prioritizing, as in ancient Rome, your efficacy in the service of your city, to, in monastic Christianity, your compassion for the mind of the other. And so that is a context that doesn't have explicit reference to God, but just as with your question, if we position the gathering of symptomatic information explicitly in the training of doctors as you are coming to know the mind and experience of your patient, and your patient has to know that that's what you're trying to do, then we both, I think, keep doctors psychologically anchored in trying to understand the richer reality that the patient is dealing with, and we help patients to be more connected to the doctor, because doctors can also be treated as just machines. I came in here because this is happening, and you're supposed to make it go away. Like, don't sit here and talk to me. Just tell me the problem and give me the prescription. I want to get out of here. And maybe the patient's going through a lot that day. They just had a big fight with their spouse, and they're worried about their on probation of their job, or who knows. They just want to get in and out. But that too, then doctors also psychologically in their formation have to be supported to recognize sometimes you're going to get jerk patients who are going to treat you like a machine. And you're going to kind of hate that patient maybe. But then that's an opportunity for the doctor to think like an ideal parent would. This kid is acting up here, and I read this phrase once in a parenting book, or probably in some like flowery motivational thing on a Twitter feed or something. Children need your love the most when they deserve it the least. And that's true of doctors. Doctors need your love the most when they deserve it the least. And it's true of patients. And so that is an implicitly theological claim, at least historically speaking. That's how it entered our culture, was through Christian theology. The prizing of compassion came into Western culture, at least through Christian theology. And it's an interpersonal claim that keeps us anchored in one another's good. The willing the good for the other, and desiring union with the other through the understanding of the other's mind. Yes, sir, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a few technical questions that lead
Great.
into theological questions, if that's okay. So you said a few times that neural networks are opaque and that they're black boxes, and I would like to push back against that a little bit. For example, the example of medical imaging of knee pain definitely implements a convolutional neural network, for example, and those are quite literally representations of visual concepts, right? So you can use a lot of tricks like visualizing intermediate convolutional inputs, visualizing the filters themselves, visualizing heat maps. For example, throughout the entire network, if I feed a convnet an image of an elephant, at the very end, I can map individual pixels and areas according to which class that they maximally activate. For example, with the elephant, that trunk is going to light up, the ears are going to light up. For activating individual filters, for example, if I feed a convolutional neural network a blank input and then run gradient ascent actually on the input space, I can create an entire image that activates a single layer of the network, right? So if I am classifying cats, I can generate an entire picture of what looks like grass, because at the very beginning of the neural network in imaging, it's looking for local features, and those local features is cat hair. And then later in the network, you can get something really freaky, like a collage of ears, a snout. I don't think a cat is a snout, but like paws and things like that. So I guess the question here is, what does it mean for you for a network or AI to be considered interpretable, like, in general?
Yeah, I think those are great examples, because it is true that with networks that are involved in visual classification, it's possible, as with the example that I cited of the knee pain, it's possible to probe the different layers to find the image that most highly activates this node, and to do statistical analysis to figure out which part of the network is most strongly contributing to the final classification, to figure out what is it looking for. And so in that sense, that kind of network is not a black box. It can be very difficult to ascertain what it's looking for, and it can be sometimes difficult to figure out what's meaningful about that. And that's why even when, like for networks that predict the weather, or for networks that have been used in self-driving cars, there was a complaint early on with the self-driving cars that, well, it doesn't seem that it's actually driving. It's just somehow hitting the jackpot by patterns of specular reflection on the glassy buildings around it. But of course, little winking reflections are giving a sense of optical flow, and the buildings are on either side of the street. Turns out we kind of drive that way too. The buildings help us retain a sense of space. So it's not driving, it's just doing it in a more subtle way. So yes, with visual applications, it's far easier to see what's going on. But it's very difficult to interpret what's going on when you just have masses of numbers that have been labeled by humans, and why something contributes particularly to the network is not always clear. And then as with the large language models, it becomes even more opaque, that because it's been trained to predict the next word, the only answer for why did it say that is that's the kind of thing statistically that would be said in this context. And so it's very important, as you, I think, rightly point out, that those who are responsible for teaching us how to use these tools must know how they work and must be able to express how they work in a way that doesn't lead us to over-interpret what they've been giving. So even the word intelligence, or understanding, or speaking, when we speak of various AI applications, these things can lead us to attribute a greater significance to the output than what is actually there. And that's why I think that I at least preferred the language of statistical landscapes, which is kind of hard. You know, if nobody's had any math, then what does that even mean? But there are ways in which we, like wine tasting, for instance. Someone develops their palate. They become sensitive to little dynamics in the flavors. Those dynamics correspond to general labels like Malbec or Chardonnay or things, but you know, then there are subtleties of different brands and different years, and the label, there's some slippage over the years as to what the labeling of the wine even means, and the new varieties are classified, etc. So I think that big data and the use of neural networks it's a little bit like wine tasting, that you have a palate that's sensitive to a lot more than what is actually labeled. But if you just are slapping a label on it on the output, and then don't forget you've also labeled the inputs, you have this kind of double interpretation of the network that can potentially, without your knowing it, can limit what the network's able to see or to do. And when we don't know that, it's in that sense that the network becomes the black box, because it doesn't provide for us a theory of what it's classifying. It just provides a successful mapping. And the last example of this, especially in the large language models, people speak of hallucination, that well, sometimes it hallucinates the answer, it's not actually something. That's not it's confabulating. It's always confabulating. It's confabulating based on the statistical landscape of the kind of things that people are saying. It doesn't know what's true or false. So it's not remembering sometimes, but hallucinating others. It's always generating the most likely thing that would be said in this context, and we call it hallucination or recall, or hallucination or report, because we are the ones who recognize that some of these answers are accurate and others are not. So even the way we talk about these systems shapes our expectations and can shape them in a direction that doesn't correspond to the way the system actually works.
Okay, perfect. And I have a follow-up for that.
Yeah, please do.
Well,
Good.
if you don't mind. So, in the last 3 years, people like Neil Nanda at Google, for example, they've been looking deeply into something called mechanistic interpretability. And what they're trying to do there is they're actually trying to do exactly what you said, and that's completely specify a neural network's computation in terms of human understandable algorithms that they can reverse engineer to provide more granular understanding of exactly what's going on. And what they've actually shown is that LLMs, large enough, are able to internally represent board states in games like chess and Othello. They're able to structure mazes. They've shown they've been able to map conceptual domains like color and direction, grounded world maps, given a few examples, for instance. And it contradicts the fact that you've said that neural networks do not develop theoretical models. What they've successfully shown is that they're not just predictive models, and that they're able to actually be entities that create complex internal world models. Like the simplest example that I can think of is LLMs are notoriously bad at just adding numbers in general. But what one was able to do, and what they were able to show, is that one of them was able to construct a theory about adding numbers that implemented sine and cosine to walk around the unit circle as a way of implementing the modulo operator. So a very, very weird way of just carrying the one to be able to just add something together. And so the question here is, if neural networks are able to develop theoretical models, would that change any of your beliefs about AI, like, for example, concerning knowledge and generating wisdom, something like that?
Okay, so yeah, that's an excellent question. If neural networks are able to develop theoretical models, would that change the assessment of AI? Yes. If a neural network is actually developing a theoretical model that it can report on, such that it's accurately reporting concerning the mechanism of its own deliberation, that would be incredibly useful. It would also be incredibly useful if some other system is interrogating the network and is watching its functioning to be able to explain to us why the network did what it did. All of that would be incredibly useful because we would no longer be, that's exactly what we need, we would no longer be having the tool as a buffer between us and the reality we're trying to investigate. So even the example of the piano tuner, if the piano tuner has a tool that tells it which frequency the strings are resonating at, that's exactly what a piano tuner is interested in. Now there are other cases in which, like I said, with the piano you don't just want the pure tones, you want the interaction between the tones, but maybe a machine could be developed to assess that. In fact, a neural network is probably just the kind of thing that could learn to do that if you could represent somehow accurately what's going on in the piano in a numerical fashion, and that's a real question. So yes, explainable AI and even a kind of like wonder of wonders, AI that could explain itself would be really useful. That being said, every few months there are various experiments where someone proposes that they've gotten the AI to think theoretically, and then it turns out that in its training set there was a lot of stuff that was kind of like that, and so it's not really thinking theoretically, it's just babbling in a mode that is interpretable by us. And so this is why I like to keep up with some of these AI developers on X and watch them interact with one another and get into serious smackdowns. So there's Jan LeCun, who often is very optimistic about these things, and he wants to like give a sort of like full-blooded kind of like cognitive interpretation of what's going on. And then Gary Marcus is always there to think, nah, this is just smoke and mirrors. They're both highly skilled mathematicians and computer scientists, and so they kind of are a useful check on one another, I think. And so this is, I would say that the limitations of AI with respect to theorization are perhaps empirical limitations. It's a technology under development. Other methods other methods might work. What though, I mean, and this is a priori belief of mine, what though I think that AIs will never be able to do is what AIs with the kind of technology of which we're aware will never be able to do is have an experience and to have a direct, engaged, first-person encounter with reality. We, not unlike computers, receive our contact with reality through sensors, and we interact with reality through effectors. And we can even, to some extent, we can quantify the inputs that are coming into our bodies. And yet, as proof that chemistry and physics as we currently define them don't give a full account of what's going on, there is no apparent reason why we should have an experience at all. Some would say, therefore, there must be some additional element to us that chemistry doesn't encompass. But I think the more straightforward answer is that there's stuff about chemicals that's a lot spookier than what we can currently quantify, or perhaps ever quantify. Because I mean, I believe humans have a soul, but I also believe that squirrels have an experience too, and I don't think squirrels have a transcendent spiritual element the way we do, and yet they have an experience. So clearly, we haven't fully characterized what material reality is all about, what it can do. And so, well, the reason why I say that nonetheless, I don't believe that AI technologies as we currently have it will ever have the intelligentsia that we do, the kind of perception and engagement with reality, is because the very definition of artificial intelligence in terms of this quantifiable accomplishment of measurable goals falls short of what we're up to. We can put what we're up to into those terms, but those terms don't encompass what we're up to. It's a projection into a lower dimensional space. That lower dimensional space, I don't think will ever equal ours. Something else would have to be done. Some other technology or other element to it would have to be brought forth to begin approaching what we do. And maybe never. Maybe we need souls to have this kind of transcendent point of view. Thank you.
Well, on that note about souls, thank you so much, Dr. Wales. This was an amazing talk.
Thank you.
And I hope if people want to ask you any additional questions, they can come up and,
Yeah,
and
sure.
talk to you now. I know that I would like to. So.
Thank you, Claire, for putting on another great event for us.
Dr. Buffel.
And Dr. Buffel for bringing Dr. Wales.
Yeah, thank you all. I really enjoyed this. It's fun to. One of the things I miss about grad school is getting to talk to a lot of people who know what I do and can kind of check me. But another thing I miss about grad school is knowing a lot of high caliber students outside of my domain who bring their own questions and everything. Because now I'm in institutions exclusively undergraduate, and so usually they just kind of sit there and accept my wisdom as being the total horizon of the truth. So it's great to talk to you who are well trained in a domain that is different from mine to bring your questions. It's you with your interest in computer science, clearly.